Welcome back to Lore for Rest from deep in the house of lore, a relaxing, quietly voiced study series of a few of our favorite stories. Visuals will be limited, so feel free to close your eyes, relax, or focus on other things. It's fine to just listen. Let's get started. In our last study, we examined the history of Bloomburrow as a plane of existence within the Magic the Gathering universe. Today, we'll take a look at the creatures of the realm, the animal folk that bravely battle the calamity beasts. Batfolk. Batfolk are mysterious, superstitious creatures, always glancing to the cosmos for guidance. Their societies have staunchly rigid roles and hierarchies, along with a strong sense of order and tradition. Batfolk often consider themselves destined and ordained protectors of Valley, using this belief to spur on their spiritual studies. Being such elevated creatures, they unfortunately often fail to participate in small talk and platitudes, instead thinking on a vast cosmic scale. They are frequently solitary, keeping Valley safe while other animal folk sleep, seeing themselves as balancing the protection of night with that of daytime. Batfolk celebrate the phases of the moon with a ritual called the lunar paeon, reading star charts and doling out guidance. With such an insistence on order and structure, Batfolk often butt heads with Otterfolk, while being more amicable with Birdfolk, who share their aerial sights and their need for structure. Birdfolk. Birdfolk keep the various communities of Valley connected, delivering male and even small animals across the lands. Considering themselves natural leaders amongst the animal folk, Birdfolk are selfless and chivalrous, always seeking to protect those around them and to bring about peace. Unfortunately, this trait can lead to seeming self-important and patronizing, leading into our next point that birdfolk are very particular about their looks and social standing, often gathering specifically for the purpose of elevating appearances. These noble creatures take part in a ritual called the Plume Creed, in which birdfolk must fly to the tip of the world and leave his or her mark in the form of a feather. Those who are successful are blessed with supernatural speed and agility, marking themselves as wind-crested. You'll often find birdfolk in adventuring parties with mousefolk, both being eager for glory and exciting journeys, while they tend to avoid frogfolk, whose more cautious nature runs antithetical to their adventuring spirit. Frogfolk. Augurs that use their knowledge of the natural world to monitor the movement of the calamity beasts and the resulting shifts in seasons. Frogfolk specialize in various types of magic, from elemental use to water work and divination. These creatures hold a vast wellspring of insight. Powerful magic tended from the natural world allows these creatures to receive premonitions of the future to varying degrees. The strongest of them can pinpoint exact movements of the calamity beasts and force nature to react in specific ways to mitigate damage. As such, frogfolk tend to be pessimistic and fearful, as illustrated by Helga, skittish seer, though they cannot all be categorized as such. This pragmatic outlook can tend toward viewing other animal folk as naive, though the frogfolk are not cruel creatures. They help and tend just as the other folk do, and always work to ensure their safety. Using this vast knowledge of the natural arts, frog folk do not traditionally farm, but instead manipulate their environment to encourage the growth of specific flora. Frog folk share a special relationship with raccoon folk for this very reason, while disapproving of the brash nature of mouse folk. Lizard folk. Being the only animal folk not native to Valley, lizard folk tend to live their lives outside the greater collective, contributing only as they please and giving no standing to societal norms or hospitality. These fiery creatures tend to come off as uncooperative and impulsive, but they rival mouse folk in their love for adventure. Favors and grudges both hold a great deal of weight for lizard folk, their relationships often being purely transactional in regards to forgiveness or reciprocation. Surprisingly, lizard folk place great importance on the creation of art, whether it be metalworking, painting, or weaving. Fabrics, not the magical type. They revel in both the creation and destruction of art, hoping to capture the awe of a moment before turning to a new creation. Lack or excess of energy is a problem for lizard folk, and they must either rest or sunbathe to balance themselves out. The hyper-powered state can be a boon in battle, with the little creatures becoming frenzied before unloading that stored energy onto their enemies. Being worshippers of fire, lizard folk do tend to the hearths in the cold seasons of Valley and help control wildfire during the blazing ones. Fire is both a spiritual and functional part of their everyday lives. In this, lizard folk often get along with bat folk, both cultures sharing a love of ritual and the deeper meanings of nature. Rat folk and lizard folk often fail to understand each other, given that lizard folk believe their culture and art to be fleeting rather than holding on to relics. Mouse folk. Known for being brave warriors and fearless adventurers, mouse folk always seek to uphold the honor bestowed upon them by their forebears. Action-oriented and always moving, these creatures tend to be led by impulse rather than planning ahead, which unfortunately often leads to danger. Regardless of situation, mouse folk tend to be optimistic and good-natured, much to the chagrin of some animal folk. Frog folk, particularly. Deeply invested in the folk of Valley, mouse folk do not hesitate to offer assistance in any manner, no matter how big or small the task may be. Mouse folk tend to live in large, multi-generational families, which offers a more collaborative collective than a few sparse creatures alone. They sometimes tend to put communal good and heroic deeds above their own well-being. Again, an irritation to some, who ironically mousefolk actually deeply respect and admire. While sharing an adventurous spirit, mousefolk and otterfolk tend to butt heads, as mousefolk believe otters to be too playful. Otterfolk. Chaotic and playful, otterfolk often make games of even the most dangerous tasks. Storm chasers, who channel lightning into their own magical weaving, otterfolk are often seen provoking calamity beasts in order to capture their energy. This act is called clamming, or even more risky things like stealing their hairs or snatching embers from their coats. Most otterfolk live in houseboats, making their homes in the rivers of Valley, not beholden to one territory or another. Otterball, a chaotic, ruleless game only understood by those who play it, is the most popular pastime for these creatures. These danger seekers are incredibly adept at spell casting and get along well with rabbit folk while finding frog folk to be boring with their lack of gusto. Rabbit folk. Ah, my favorite animal folk. The farmers of Valley. Rabbit folk tend to be homebodies whose cooking is unrivaled. A vast respect for nature and its bounties is deeply inherent for those creatures. They prefer hospitality and peaceful means over any other when it comes to dealing with other animal folk, often avoiding confrontation. Unfortunately, they are prone to indecision, especially when it comes to complex matters, which activates a fight or flight response in them. Community is the most important concept to a rabbit folk, who sometimes never leave the village they're born to. Their large families, called fluffles, work as a hierarchy framework for their lives, and even those who are brave enough to venture beyond their villages are often adopted by another clan of rabbit folk. Despite their pacifist nature, rabbit folk will fiercely guard the homes they've built, usually joining the Paw Patch Party in order to train and patrol the lands. Dedicated and diligent, these beings are highly sought after in many aspects of everyday valley life. Mouse folk are often seen working and adventuring in tandem with rabbit folk, as their familial lives and structures are similar, while rabbit folk usually find lizard folk to be brash, rude, and antithetical to the way their lives are lived. Raccoon folk. Hoarders, collectors, wanderers. Just like their namesake animals, raccoon folk make home wherever they might be. Seeing something new is the modus operandi for every raccoon folk, and their drive for discovery puts them at the forefront of many adventures. In spite of this, they have short attention spans and often bore easily, sometimes leaving in the midst of such journeys. Given that they spend most of their lives roaming, raccoon folk are experts at locations around Valley and some even in the brambles beyond Valley's borders. Their hoarded treasures create their memories and even their cultures. Individual raccoon folk often create their own oral traditions, leaving behind many tales to be woven together. Because of this, bat folk often see raccoon folk as too scattered, in stark contrast to their own strict societies, while otter folk mesh well with the risk-taking chaos that these creatures enjoy. Rat folk. The lore keepers of Valley, rat folk collect secrets, knowledge, and even relics of the plane and formation of Valley. While they previously shared their knowledge freely, current generations of rat folk tend to be secretive and suspicious. When someone nearly destroys your entire home with secrets they don't know how to wield, that tends to happen. They can be self-sufficient, intelligent, and thoughtful, or distrusting and uncooperative. Most rat folk take an insect companion, often substituting the camaraderie of outsiders for their lone companionship and even forming a psychic bond with the creature. Despite their isolation, rat folk are freely welcomed throughout Valley, sharing their cultural expertise with the masses, albeit carefully and cautiously. Their shared oddities make rat folk and squirrel folk easy friends, while rat folk tend to be repulsed by the recklessness and brashness of lizard folk. Squirrel folk. Solitary and superstitious, squirrel folk of Valley prefer nature to the company of others. Understanding and even being celebratory of death causes squirrel folk to get an odd glance from fellow animal folk. They acknowledge that death, especially those of the calamity beasts, is part of the natural cycle and is needed for balance in all things. They strongly believe that calamity beasts contained trapped natural energy that must be returned to the soil. For most, this is only a ritual burial. For others, this is a chance at necromancy. As squirrels are wont to do, squirrel folk tend to create stores of food, often trading their goods with other animal folk and keeping the inhabitants of valley fed should a season be particularly fierce. Because of this, squirrel folk tend to have good relationships with rabbit folk. Most squirrel folk dislike bird folk for their haughty showmanship. Their ideals just don't align. Other animal folk. Those outside the larger communities of animal folk consist of a sparse number of creatures: weasel folk, mole folk, fox folk, who are communally included in the goings-on of Valley. There are some in Valley, however, that totally break the mold. Given that no humans exist on the plain of Bloomburrow, even our illustrious planeswalkers enter the realm a little changed. Jace is a fox, Elspeth a mouse, Karn a tree, Narset a bird, Liliana a squirrel, of course, Nissa a frog, Teferi a bird, Domri is a rat folk, Garrick a mighty badger, Tamio a rabbit, and Ral an otter. It's interesting to see that no one enters the plain unchanged. Of course, if you got your hands on the Bloomburrow secret lair, a few more familiar faces appear. Soren Markov is, most appropriately, a bat folk. Watley is a bird folk. Kiora an axolotl. Vraska a snake. And Tezzeret a rat folk. Curiously, Helga, the skittish seer, has a vision of Vraska where she appears as a lizard folk. Of course, the secret lair is considered what if, and the cards aren't canon, so take them as you wish. That's it for our study of the Animalfolk of Bloomburrow. See you next time, deep in the House of Lore.